Amen. Amen. Well, this is the last sermon in the series titled By Faith. And, as I was studying this week, I was just reminded of the fact that in the early church, these letters were read out loud. And they were read out loud as letters. They weren't chopped up. They didn't have chapter divisions like we do. And so they would have sat down and heard it in one reading. And that's really when the power of it comes, is to read it. Even if you just read Hebrews chapter 11, once you get to the part that says, of whom the world was not worthy, people were probably standing up and shouting and applauding and all kinds of stuff, because there's just a lot of power that comes as you remember the stories of people who lived inspirational lives. That's true in church settings. It's true in life. I watched the NFL Hall of Fame the other day. When those men came across the stage, it wasn't like, even if it was a Dallas Cowboy, everyone was cheering for them. That's what happens when people have lived inspirationally. We get inspired because of their witness. And so the preacher that wrote this book, this letter of Hebrews, he concludes Hebrews chapter 11 in this way, because you remember his goal from Hebrews chapter 10 was to encourage them to live faithfully. These people were facing potential persecution. They were facing the temptation to bow down to other idols, to be more accepted within their context. And in light of all these temptations, he's trying to inspire them to live a faithful life. Despite the risk of persecution or suffering or martyrdom, live a faithful life. He does so by uplifting stories, so that as they remember these people of great faith who were flawed people just like them, the memory of them could inspire them to be a faithful person, so that they might say, Moses did it, I'm going to do it too. Abraham did it, with God's help, I'm going to do it too. And so that's why he concludes with just a list of these stories, just calling to mind Barak and Jephthah, Samuel, the prophets, and all these people who were flawed but faithful. Because as we hear their stories, they teach us something. Their stories teach us that there's hope beyond the isolation that we might experience because of the call to faith. That's what comes to mind when we hear the word Noah. Yes, we think of the ark, but we also think of what Noah went through as he's building the ark. I mean, imagine Noah coming to your house and saying, can I borrow some tools? You're like, man, you've been building that thing for a long time. If I let you borrow this hammer, I'm never going to see it again. For decades upon decades, he's isolated. He's ridiculed. He's looked upon with shame because he answered the call of God. And he wasn't vindicated until the waters came. We learn that we can trust God when we cannot see the outcome. That's what comes to mind, at least in my mind, when I hear the name Abram or Abraham. I remember that God came to Abraham and said, I want you and your family to pack up and go to a place where I will show you. Now, whenever we're going on a trip, one of the first things I do before I pull off is I say to Ashanti, what's the address so I can punch it in? If Sarah said that to Abraham, he'd have said, well, first of all, I don't know what GPS is, and second of all, I don't know the address. We're just going to go and trust that God will lead us and guide us. These stories teach us that even when God's promises seem laughable, and even when God's promises reveal our doubts, we can still be faithful. Isn't that what you think of when Sarah comes to mind? As God is meeting with Abraham, and Sarah's, she's really eavesdropping. I was going to say she's listening, but she was eavesdropping out there. She didn't have any business listening to what they're saying, but she was eavesdropping, and she heard God say to Abraham, this time next year, Sarah's going to have a child. And what did Sarah do? She laughed. She laughed. And then God said, why did you laugh? Sarah said, I didn't laugh. And the creator of heaven and earth said, oh, yes, you did laugh. So we learn that when God's promises seem laughable and they raise our doubts, we can still be faithful. All these stories and the few that were briefly scanned today in the reading, they highlight to us the wisdom of faith. And it's important that they highlight the wisdom of faith because we get to see the entire span of their lives. We see Noah being called to do something, and we see how faith vindicated him. We see Sarah and how faith vindicated her. We see Moses and how he was vindicated as he placed his trust in God. And it's good to see that because in our present lives, we don't yet see the vindication. We don't yet see the fulfillment of the promise. We see glimpses of it. But as we encounter situations on a day-to-day basis, what we see is the opportunity to live by faith, but we also see the presence of compromise. And as we look at these people, we see that they chose faith over compromise. Compromise always seems like the wise choice in the present moment, doesn't it? Because typically when you're called to compromise, it will deliver you into something that's more safe, something that's more secure, doesn't it? That's what compromise does. But from these stories, we see people who chose faithfulness over compromise, even when choosing faithfulness over compromise meant certain suffering, isolation, maybe persecution. Church history tells us that in many cases, martyrdom. But when you look at the big picture, when you look at the long view, we see that faith is always preferable. Well, how are they able to live such faithful lives in the face of suffering? Well, it's because of their beliefs, because of what they believed. They believed that God was creating something new that would usher in a new kind of reality, that God was making everything better. Therefore, since they believed that God was making everything better, they lived towards that future reality. They lived towards the future reality rather than conforming to the present existence, to the present reality. And as they did so, God strengthened them. God increased their faith. As the suffering increased, the grace increased. I love that hymn that says, He giveth more grace when the burden grows greater. That's what God did for them. As they faced persecution, as they faced ridicule, God increased their faith to such a degree that the preacher of this book says the world was not worthy of them. Their example was such that they bore so much witness to God and the salvation that God was bringing that the world was unworthy of their presence. They were standing on the tips of their toes, as it were, arranging their lives in a kind of reality that would make more sense in the future than it did in the present moment. That's how they lived by faith. And because they did so, we all have examples of how we ought to live. We all have examples of how we ought to live. And we actually have a better example because we're in a better situation than all of them. And I'm not just talking about technological advancements and things like that, but we're in a better situation because they were standing on the tips of their toes and squinting to see what God was going to do. We can look back with absolute clarity and see what God has done through Jesus Christ. So we're in a much better position than Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. We're in a better position than Rahab and Sarah and Moses and all the prophets. And you should think that thought right now that, man, the life of faith that I could lead is so much better than the life of faith that Abraham could lead. And that's Jesus picked up on that when he said, remember when he said of John the Baptist that the least person is greater than him. Because the opportunity that we have through Jesus Christ supersedes them. So as we look back and we see the example of faith that they give us with less clarity about what God was going to do, the question that should rise up in our minds is, how should we live in light of their lives and in light of the clarity that we have of what God has done, even as we anticipate what God will do? The writer he begins to transition towards giving solutions because he wants these people to choose faith, to choose God. And so he transitions from telling the story of those who lived by faith, and now he's talking to them and us in the present moment to instruct us on what we can do to be responsive to the call of faith that God has on our own lives. And so he says, Therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely. What does it mean that we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses? Now, some people think that that means that all the hosts of heaven, all of our loved ones, all the saints are in heaven looking down on us and gazing upon us and cheering us on. And I believe that that is true in some respects. I do believe that they're inclined to root for us. Now, do I think that they're watching us? Absolutely not. Because they're in heaven. They see the face of God. I don't think that right now my dad is gazing down upon me like, man, I wonder what he's going to say next. Why? Because, he's by the Apostle Paul. You know what I mean? He can, if he wants to hear a good message, go and talk to Paul. They're not fixing their eyes on us because their eyes were fixed on Jesus in this life, so their eyes are fixed on Jesus now. They are aware, I believe, of what's going on, and so in that respect, I believe that they're rooting for us and interceding on our behalf, as we learn in the book of Revelation. But I think the emphasis is not supposed to be on them watching us as we run the race. I think the emphasis is supposed to be on us, learning from them, having finished the race, so that we can learn from them and incorporate the same kind of devotion and faithfulness that they incorporated, so that when we join them, we can join with a legacy of faith that's similar to the one that they had. I think that's what it means, that we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, which means that everywhere we look, we can learn from those who lived faithfully. So then the question is, since we have so many examples of what faithfulness looks like, how then should we live? How then should we live? Listen to what the writer says. Let us also, by using the word also, he's indicating that this is what they did. Let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely. Get rid of the heavy weights that are slowing you down. Now, he's using athletic language here. He finishes by saying, let us run the race. So he's trying to call their mind to their version of the Olympics, maybe. And they would have all known that when these athletes are training, just like athletes today do, sometimes they'll strap some weights on their ankles. So they're trying to make training more difficult. But when it's time for the real race, they're not out there with the weights on their ankles, are they? Wouldn't it have been strange if one of our swimmers had cables attached to them during the race for the gold? We would have said, hold on, I think he's lost his mind. Take the weights off so you can win the gold, right? We don't, when it's time for the real race, we lay aside the weights. That's what the author's saying. You're now in the race. They've finished the race. They've passed off the baton. Now it's your turn. So also lay aside the weights. Get rid of the heavy weights that are slowing you down so that you can run this race with perseverance, with speed, with efficiency, with faithfulness. And I'm glad he didn't just say lay aside the sin. Aren't you glad he didn't say that? Because sometimes that's all we do is we focus on the bad things that we should avoid. But he said lay aside the weights and the sin. What does that mean? Well, by using that language, he prioritizes winning. He prioritizes the right prize. This isn't a life, he says, that's just about avoiding the bad thing, but it's a life that prioritizes a certain way of finishing. Lay aside the weights and the sin that obstruct your path. And not just you as an individual, but the weights that obstruct the path of those in your community. Paul picks up on this in Romans where he says, and listen to these words, if eating meat makes my brother or sister stumble, I will never eat meat again. What does he have in mind? The weights. He's like, I want to finish this race, but I want you to finish the race with me. So if eating meat makes you stumble, guess what I am? A vegetarian. And I ain't eating the Impossible Burger either, because you're going to still think it's a burger. I'm not doing that. I'm going to lay it aside. You see the mindset that these early Christians had? We're going to get there. We're going to have the kind of life that God has prepared for us. We're going to have it together. So I'm going to live a life of sacrifice in order that I may receive the life of God, but also that you may receive the life of God. So I'm going to set aside the weights. I'm going to set aside the weights, the obstructions, the things that constrict us. I'm going to make sure that there's no hurdles that are in the way. I'm going to lay them aside. Now, I hate to say this, but I think, especially in the last 100 years, I think we in the West, we've come at this thing the wrong way. We're not really focused on laying aside weights anymore, let alone the sins that trip us up. That hasn't really been our focus. In an attempt to grow the church, numerically I should add, what we've done is say the weights aren't important. We've made Christianity into something along the lines of minimal entrance requirement exams. All you got to do is ... That's what the whole seeker-friendly movement that expanded the church numerically. How can we build our buildings so it's more comfortable? How can we change our language so it's more amenable to the guest? So that when they come, they feel welcome. They understand what's going on here. And this shows up in small ways. I hate to deviate from my lecture, but see, I'm in school mode. It's not a lecture, it's a sermon. Churches don't use the word narthex anymore. You guys know what a narthex is? That gathering place out there. You know what they call it now? A hallway. Now that's a small thing, but why did they decide, stop saying narthex? Because the guest may come in and not know what we're talking about. So let's change our language to be more friendly to the person who's new. Rather than saying, let's incorporate them into the life of God here so that they understand the language that we as the people of God use. See, it's a difference. It's a difference. And it happened in subtle and small ways where instead of looking at how we can help one another lay aside the weights and the sins, we prioritized ease and comfort as part of the life of the church. And people came in droves. People came, we did numbers, guys. We did crazy numbers in terms of church growth in the last 100 years. But you know where we didn't do so well? Is in the transformation of life that those who came in would have experienced. And so our messages had call to actions that said something like, if you just pray this prayer, then you'll go to heaven when you die. And people did pray the prayers, and they will go to heaven when they die. But how will they live here? Will they live in such a way that those in the Faith Hall of Fame will look down and be like, oh my goodness, can you see that boy Meshach? You see the witness he's bearing for Jesus Christ? Man, you see those Christians in Montgomery? The world better watch out, man. They're making some noise down there. When we prioritized ease and comfort in an attempt to get more people to come into our doors, we under-prioritize the transformation of life that God wants to bring to those people. Because that transformation comes through things like suffering and sacrifice. And words like suffering and sacrifice don't go hand in hand with words like ease and comfort, does it? When I was a youth pastor, it occurred to me after like 6 months that all the things that I was teaching about, all the questions that I was answering were questions that revealed that we're prioritizing the wrong goal. There are questions like, can I smoke and be a Christian? Can I drink and be a Christian? Can I have sex with my boyfriend or my girlfriend and be a Christian? Those questions have transformed now into a more mature version, and I'm answering them now as we're in a political season. Is it okay for me to vote Democrat and be a Christian? Is it okay for me to vote Republican and be a Christian? These questions have the wrong prize in mind. They're looking at Christianity from the wrong angle, aren't they? Those aren't the kind of questions that Olympic athletes ask their trainers, are they? Wouldn't it be strange if An Olympic athlete went to their trainer and said to them, hey, can I eat McDonald's and be a gold medalist? Can I live the same kind of life that my non-athletic friends are leading and be a gold medalist? The trainer would look at them and say, like, what are you here for? What are you here for? Are you here to shave off a couple tenths of a second from your time in the next 4 years? Or are you here to be like everybody else? Are you here to stand on the podium because you've won the prize, because of the narrow life of devotion that you've led? Are you here for that, or are you here to be like everybody else? See, becoming a Christian is easy. And I say this all the time. I know it seems controversial, but I believe that when we stand before God, God will let anybody into his presence who he thinks can stand to be there. So getting into heaven is easy. That's why the Bible doesn't prioritize it. If you read through the Bible, it doesn't prioritize getting into heaven when you die. It prioritizes something that's much more explosive than that: union with God. As I think it was St. Athanasius, he said, God became a human so that humans can become like God. That's what the Bible prioritizes. Having our lives lived in such a way where we can say with Jesus, not my will, O God, but thy will be done. First in me and then in the world. And in order for me to say, not my will, but thy will be done, there's a whole lot of transformation that has to happen within me so that my will can be suppressed to the point of being evaporated, and I cling to the will of God, which is good for me and good for everybody else. That's what these people in Hebrews, that's the legacy that they leave for us. Why were they able to live that way? Well, because they were peering forward to see the salvation that God was bringing into the world in Jesus Christ. But we don't have to peer forward. We can look back with utter clarity and see Jesus and see the life that he led with all of its beauty, with all of its strength, with all of his power. We see what God does when a person surrenders to God entirely. Through one man, the entire cosmos experiences salvation. We see that in Jesus. And seeing that in Jesus, we have the opportunity to say, I'll live that way too then. By faith, I will say, not my will, but thy will be done. I will run the race like Jesus ran the race, like Paul ran the race, like Peter ran the race, like St. Francis of Assisi, like John Wesley, like Mother Teresa. I'll run the race like they ran the race. So our Catholic sisters and brothers, they have a better conception of what the Christian life is supposed to be like. Theirs is better than ours. When you join their numbers, they will say something like, we're going to make a saint out of you. Isn't that appealing? What are you going to do with me, Father, as I join this church? Well, our goal is that you'll become a saint. Don't you love to hear that? Anyone here want to be a saint? And not just in the biblical sense where we're all saints right now, but I'm talking about an observable saint, where it's said of you, as it was said of Mother Teresa, you knew she entered into the room before you saw her there, because you felt her holiness emanating from her, and you could feel it. You could feel the love, joy, peace, patience, kindness just oozing out of her because of her godliness. So how do we become like that? Well, we're not peering forward to see something that's blurry and fuzzy, but we look at Jesus. He concludes, listen to what he says, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and he's now taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. I love the fact that he didn't say look to Jesus, but looking to Jesus. It's a continuous action. I'm looking to Jesus. That I was singing this song earlier this morning while I was doing my devotional. That song where it goes, worldlings prize their gems of beauty and cling to gilded toys of dust, boast of wealth and fame and treasure, only Jesus will I trust. Since mine eyes have looked on Jesus, I've lost sight of all beside. So enchained my spirit's vision, gazing on the crucified. All for Jesus, all for Jesus. That's sometimes I realize as I get deceived by the trick of life, and I feel myself being pulled towards something like wealth and comfort. And then I realize that's the empty pursuit, Meshach. The real pursuit is becoming like him, becoming just like him in spirit and in character. And when I see him and what he did for me, but more importantly, what God did in him, I realized the best form of life is a life where I'm looking at Jesus. Therefore, if Jesus comes to me as I'm being discipled to him, and he says, Meshach, I want you to do this, I can trust that doing that is the best thing for me, even if it means I suffer. Meshach, I want you to stop doing that. I can trust that not doing that is the best thing for me, even if it's going to cause pain and suffering, because I trust him and his goodness. One day we will join that great cloud of witnesses, those whose lives have been impacted for Jesus Christ. We with our faults and our failures, but those faults and failures, they're not gonna mean much because of the faith that brought us there. That's all we'll remember. That's all Christ will remember, is the faith that delivered us there. So I encourage you to become the kind of person who answers all of life's challenges. How can I become this kind of person? How can I succeed in this area? How can I do this? Fill in the blank, fill in the blank. By faith in Jesus Christ. Looking to Jesus, the one who began our faith and the one who undoubtedly will perfect it as we keep our eyes fixed on him. That's our portion. That's our portion. My sisters and brothers, deification, union with God. Nothing else matters. I told a story of a great missionary, and with this I'll close, who sacrificed a lot. He traveled so many years and didn't see his family at all. And when he was standing in front of some students, I think he was at Harvard, and they asked him to speak of the great sacrifices he made on behalf of God. You know what he talked about instead? What Jesus did for him. And he concluded by saying, I never made a sacrifice in comparison to what that man did for me. Heavenly Father, thank you.